Hello and welcome to your first of 3 notes on the brain. I know that seems like a lot of information on the brain, but really it makes more sense to break your brain into 3 different parts. The first lecture is going to be on older brain structures, and we'll talk about why, but let's talk about what you need to have out for these notes. The first thing you need out is that paper that I gave you, the chart that looks at the brain structure and the functions. All right, you're going to have 3 different resources for looking at the brain structures. The first one is going to be these notes. The second one is going to be your book. And then the third resource I'd like you guys to have, if you can, it's available. It's an app called 3D Brain, and this app is amazing. So if you have iTunes or a Droid, it's a free app called 3D Brain. So here it is right here. This app it's just way cooler than anything I can explain or anything that your book can explain, because it lets you manipulate the parts of the brain and it tells you what each part does. It actually has way more information than you'll need, but I think this would be our best resource for studying. And then in class we'll talk about ways you're going to remember the parts of the brain. So if you can download this app to either your Droid, your iPhone, or your iPad, it's free. It's called 3D Brain. And we can use that in class to help us get through. As long as 1 person out of 2 has it, we should be good. Okay, so let's start our notes on the older brain structure. Again, you should be writing these down in your chart that I provided for you. The brain structure. So we're going to start looking at developmentally. First of all, it's called the older brain because evolutionarily speaking, parts of the brain that develop first, we're looking at in basic animals. These are the ones that all have in common. And then when we get up to our third set of notes on the cortex, that's going to be the most complicated, and that's only we find those in humans. Okay, so the older the brain, what I'm going to say, the older the animal. So let's talk about the basics. So think about your spinal cord. I'm going to be using my head a lot here. So spinal cord coming up, and the brainstem is the first part of the brain we'll talk about. Okay, so here is my spinal cord coming up right here. The first part, and I have a lot more notes on this later, so you can just kind of sketch down. The brainstem is composed of the medulla, the pons, and the reticular formation. So here's the medulla. It's the first thing coming up from the spinal cord, and the pons is just a little bit of swell after that. And then the reticular formation is made of both of these, okay? And this is considered altogether the brainstem, all right? The thalamus is not part of the brainstem. That's outside of it. We'll talk about that later. So the medulla, the pons, the reticular formation, okay? And then moving up a little bit more, so my high-brain structures. So the brainstem here, we just talked about that. Then right above that, we have our cerebellum. So here's a side picture here. So again, we have it moving up, our medulla, reticular formation, and then the cerebellum is right here. All right, let's just look at the structure now. Don't worry about all these little boxes to the side, because we'll be going into those in depth in a couple slides from now. Okay, so now let's talk about actually the functions of these hindbrains, or the brainstem. The first one we're going to talk about is the medulla. This is also called the medulla oblongata. You're going to see with some of these brain structures that there's some overlapping parts that, what I'm going to say, do the same thing, or it sounds like they do the same thing, and that's okay. We talked about this in neurotransmitters. It's not this super simple process where one thing is controlled by one thing in your brain. A lot of the times it's multiple parts. Okay, so, but the medulla is pretty simple in its mechanisms, in that it controls like the vital functions of life, and it's the first thing that develops. So thinking about going up your spinal cord, like it develops first. So this is breathing, keeping you alive, your heart rate, digestion, and then other reflexes. All right, that's a key word there. So reflexes, like you don't need to think about swallowing, it does that for you. Coughing, vomiting, sneezing, those are all reflexes that happen in your body. Your medulla is responsible for those. Okay, so think about like a developing baby. The first thing that's going to develop in there, you have your spinal cord going up, and then your medulla is things like breathing and heart rate. Okay, basic functions of life. Moving up the brain into the pons, this is going to help coordinate movement on the left and right sides of the body. Postural posture, so keeping your posture, reflexes, balance. All right, pons is big with balance. Sometimes if you people know that they have a brain injury, if they've been, their pons is been hit or something's wrong with it because they can't walk straight. They're off balance. It's almost like someone who's inebriated, like they can't walk in a straight line. All right, so this is something when someone thinks, oh, I might have a concussion, I might have a brain injury. They always look for coordination. Okay, so medulla, pons, and then the next thing up is your reticular formation, which is actually, it's an area of your brain, but remember it includes both of those portions there. This is actually a network of neurons in the brainstem and the thalamus. It kind of goes into both places. And your reticular formation is what keeps you awake and aroused, right? Or awake and aware of what's going on. It keeps your attention. So if you're awake right now listening to this, or if you kind of doze off, your reticular formation is what brings you back to the scene. All right. So sleep, arousal, and attention are my reticular formation. Again, it's that kind of network from my brainstem and into the thalamus. And that'll make more sense once you know that the thalamus is considered the place where all my senses or my brain figures out what's going on. Okay, so this is big. The thalamus is my relay station in my brain. All right, it's in control, or it gets information on all the senses except smell. Smell is the one sense that does not go through the thalamus. Your smell is actually up here, and it goes straight to your olfactory and your amygdala, and we'll talk about that later. But all the other senses go through the thalamus. This is called the relay station because it processes information from what's going on in your environment. So the thalamus is what tells your brain where to redirect so that it knows what it's doing. So you hear a sound. The thalamus says, that was a sound that I need to my ear. That information should go to my auditory or my ear. Or you see like a flash of lightning. The thalamus is what says, that is visual, and it redirects it to the visual cortex. So it's kind of decided, like it brings in all the senses and then it redirects them and tells the brain where to put it for that higher order thinking. Okay, so my thalamus is my relay station for senses in the body. All right. Next, moving up, we have the cerebellum. Remember earlier we talked the cerebellum as the little brain. This is going to be in control, and it's called the little brain because it looks like a little brain. So here's my whole brain here, and here is my cerebellum. Right? So here's my spinal cord coming up. I've got my reticular formation, my pons, and then my cerebellum's on either side of that. It's called the little brain. It's coordinated rapid voluntary movements like playing the piano. So we're not just talking about balance and coordination. We're talking about very rapid movements like kicking and throwing and playing the piano. We've found that by lesioning the cerebellum, remember we talked about that in brain imaging, so if parts of the cerebellum are cut or removed, we get very jerky, exaggerated movements, so they're not smooth. There's a difficulty walking and a loss of balance. So the pons has to do with balance, but the cerebellum is also involved in balance. And then really shaky hands. So I can't coordinate things to be like these smooth movements. It's very jerky, like here to here. So the cerebellum, small brain. I want you to start looking at, as we move up the brainstem, how we get this right and left portion of the brain. We'll talk about the split brain later, but for now, just be aware that there's two sides to these parts of the brain. The next part we're moving into is called the limbic system. The limbic system is made of a couple different structures, just like when we talked about earlier, like the brainstem is made of those three structures. The limbic system is also made of these structures here. So we'll talk about them here in just a second, but it's made of the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is my structure that contributes to the formation of memories. So we'll talk about in class some mnemonic devices on ways to remember this. But the hippocampus, look, it goes right here, and it kind of does this little like round up into the brain here. Here's my cerebellum. Hippos, I always thought that hippos have good memory. Hippocampus. All right, so any type of damage to the hippocampus has been implicated in things like Alzheimer's, not being able to keep memories or even make memories. That's all associated with the hippocampus. The next part of the limbic system is called the amygdala. We've talked about this in class a couple times already, but the amygdala is really responsible for emotions, right? So I always remember Amy is an emotional girl. All right, so my amygdala has to do with emotions, aggression, fear, and this part of the brain is also involved in looking at other people and identifying emotions. So looking at this man's face right here, and knowing that he doesn't look very happy, but he doesn't look mad, he doesn't look angry, he looks kind of sad and maybe even a little concerned. So how do I know that? Just by looking at someone's face, because my amygdala is able to recognize emotions in other people's faces. All right, the amygdala, still part of the limbic system, has a lot to do with hippocampus. Okay, so remember we talked about in class the memories that often are the strongest involve some type of emotion. Now maybe that makes more sense because that part of our brains are very closely associated. My hippocampus is right next to my amygdala, so anything that has emotion attached with it might make a stronger memory. Now, the other parts of our limbic system, the hypothalamus, we've already talked about this in our endocrine system, but now let's talk about what it has to do with our limbic system. So the hypothalamus, hypo meaning below, the thalamus, all right? So remember the thalamus, the relay station. My hypothalamus is just below. The biggest part you need to know about the hypothalamus is that it is in control or influence on the pituitary gland. But it also has to do with, so we talked about that with like development and releasing hormones. But my hypothalamus also has to do with reward center. And it actually contains a couple different nuclei, which is like a cluster of neurons within the hypothalamus that control things like sexual behavior, hunger and thirst, regulating my body temperature, circadian rhythms, talking about when you fall asleep and when you wake up, and then hormone secretion having to do with the pituitary gland. The two parts of the hypothalamus that you'll need to know, remember we talked about that there's a left and a right part of each part of these brains, is the ventral medial and the lateral part of the hypothalamus. Okay, so the ventral medial part of the hypothalamus, I want you to think ventral, vomit. This is the part of the brain that's involved with hunger that tells you to stop eating. Right? So you are full, you don't need to eat anymore. The ventral medial part of the hypothalamus would be in control of that. The other part, the lateral hypothalamus, tells you let's eat. Ventral, vomit, stop. Lateral, let's eat. So this is the part that says you need to eat, we need food. And then the ventral medial would come in and say you are full now, you can stop eating. Those are two parts of the hypothalamus that you'll be responsible for knowing, as well as knowing all these different things that the hypothalamus is in control of. And then the last part, just to reiterate this part for the hypothalamus, remember the hypothalamus is in charge of releasing the hormones. And in the endocrine system, remember we talked about that's our slow way of communicating. It's in charge, the pituitary gland's in charge of releasing all those hormones. But this is just one more type of feedback. So this is a mother who is breastfeeding. So the hypothalamus, so it's a continual circle. So the nerve impulse from the sucking motion sends a message to the hypothalamus that it needs to release oxytocin, which makes milk. And then the release of oxytocin goes here. The more sucking motion goes to the hypothalamus. It says to release more. This is actually one example of a positive feedback mechanism in your body. And you will need to know positive and negative feedback mechanisms later. But this part right here, the hypothalamus, see how it's connected with the red and the blue? So the nerve impulse, release more, releases oxytocin, and it keeps going. All right, so a positive feedback mechanism is something that creates more to be released. So, and then it increases that that action. Okay, so these notes, the older brain, you need to know the brainstem, the cerebellum, and then the limbic system. Our next notes will be on our midbrain, and then our last notes will be on our cortex. You will use that chart for all three of these notes.